She was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night, dizzy, disoriented. But the moment Janice Whitmore opened her eyes and saw that her doctor was black, all her fear turned to fury. Dr. Aaliyah Ellison was calm, composed, and highly skilled. But none of that mattered. Not to Janice. So she lashed out, first with words, then with lies. She accused Dr. Ellison of mistreatment, claimed she never gave consent, faked new symptoms, but Aaliyah wasn't one to back down. What started as a patient's tantrum became a public spectacle and would spiral into something far greater. Janice Whitmore thought no one would care about a black doctor. She never imagined it would be the very thing that took her down. Because this time, Dr. Aaliyah Ellison is done letting women like Janice get away with it. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The fluorescent lights buzzed low and steady above the polished linoleum as Dr. Aaliyah Ellison moved swiftly through the third-floor corridor, her white coat flowing behind her like the tail of a commander's uniform. There was a quiet rhythm to her steps, practiced but never hurried, her tablet held firmly against her chest, her focus razor-sharp, though softened by the warmth that always settled behind her eyes. Around her, the hospital pulsed with its usual tempo, machines beeping faintly behind closed doors, stretchers rolling by with murmured updates trailing in their wake, and nurses moving like choreographed current through the sterile hush. Here, amid the constant flux of life and fragility, Aaliyah reigned with a calm no textbook could teach. She had earned it, every fraction of it. The years of med school, the grueling residencies where sleep became myth, the long nights alone with research articles, and the silent battles with those who questioned her credentials before they ever saw her charts. But she hadn't come this far to be seen. She had come to serve, to heal, to endure. Because healing wasn't just about blood panels and prescriptions. It was also about navigating the twisted perceptions that clung to her presence like shadows. Today had been quiet, by hospital standards. Only 3 code blues before noon, 2 of which had been stabilized under her direct supervision, and a cardiac consult that had gone surprisingly well, despite the patient's initial refusal to speak to a woman doctor, which had dissolved into sheepish gratitude by the end of the evaluation. Aaliyah never gloated. She simply documented, adjusted medications, ordered follow-ups, and moved forward. She paused at the nurse's station, scrolling through a patient's file with one hand, while the other reached for her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. "Aaliyah's up," came Mia's voice, low and pointed from behind the station's partition. The ER physician leaned around the edge, one eyebrow raised, dark hair pulled into a quick bun, stethoscope still swinging at her collar. Aaliyah looked up, already sensing the tone. "Got a new admit. Room 308. Came in from county clinic. Referred for observation after some fainting spells and a blood pressure scare. Name's Janice Whitmore, 61. Complained the whole way up about some foreign nurse bruising her arm during intake. She's going to be one of those." Aaliyah sighed. Not from surprise, but from familiarity. Vitals? Stable now. But she's insistent on seeing the attending physician immediately. "I figured you might want the warning." There was no bitterness in Mia's tone, only the kind of camaraderie shared between women who had spent too many years having to prepare themselves for patients who viewed their skin tone or gender as a personal affront. Aaliyah gave her a brief nod and started down the hall, her steps once again calm, her face composed, though her pulse ticked slightly faster beneath her collar. Room 308's door was slightly ajar, the sound of a television blaring daytime news drifting out, interspersed with sharp, impatient sighs. Aaliyah knocked once, firmly. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Dr. Aaliyah Ellison. You're attending." A pause. Then came the voice, drawling, crisp around the edges like a paring knife. "You're the doctor? Well, aren't we progressive?" Aaliyah stepped into the room. Janice Whitmore sat upright in the bed, a hospital gown layered over floral pajamas, her silver hair arranged in neat curls, that didn't match the fury in her narrowed eyes. She didn't extend a hand. She looked Aaliyah up and down as if inspecting a cracked mirror. "I read your file," Aaliyah said evenly. "You've had some recent dizziness, elevated pressure, and a history of cardiac arrhythmia. I'd like to run a few more tests and—" "You'd like to experiment, I'm sure," Janice snapped, lips pursed in disgust. "I know what this is. They're just trying to shove me off to someone different so I don't make a fuss. I won't be treated like a charity case." "You're not a charity case, Ms. Whitmore," Aaliyah said, her voice soft but unmoving. "You're a patient. My only priority is your health." Janice let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Right. And next, you'll be telling me you went to a real medical school." Aaliyah didn't flinch. She had heard it before, in tones kinder, in words more veiled, but the poison always tasted the same. She turned to the monitor, adjusted the cuff on Janice's arm, and began typing into her tablet with practiced precision. Her silence was not defeat. It was restraint. "You don't have to like me," she said finally, not looking up, "but you do have to let me help you." "I'll be speaking to the hospital director," Janice said curtly, pulling her arm back. "I'm sure you will," Aaliyah said, her voice as cool as glass. And with that, she exited the room, letting the door click quietly behind her. She didn't have to see Janice's expression to know it hadn't softened. Back at the station, Mia raised an eyebrow. "How bad?" "She's going to be a problem," Aaliyah said, sipping her cold coffee again. "And she's not here for healing." Then she turned back to her notes, the calm of her face belying the knot beginning to tighten in her chest. She had treated worse. She had survived worse. But this wasn't going to be one of those patients who left in peace. No, Janice Whitmore was going to stay and fester. The morning had barely broken over the skyline when Aaliyah returned to the third floor. The haze of pre-dawn filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the corridor. Nurses were changing shifts, passing clipboards, speaking in hushed tones as the building exhaled from the chaos of the night. For Aaliyah, there was no pause, no reset, only the continuation of what had already begun. She glanced at her schedule, but her eyes drifted instinctively toward room 308. Something in her gut refused to be silenced. Janice Whitmore's name blinked on her chart, unchanged since the night before. But Aaliyah had learned long ago that the worst turns came quietly, without warning, wrapped in the illusion of stability. When she stepped through the door, she found the air in the room wrong. Janice's skin, pale before, now looked waxy and sallow. The bravado from the day before had vanished, replaced by a confused, unfocused gaze. Her breaths were shallow, uneven, and her fingers gripped the sheet tightly, as though she were trying to hold herself to the bed. "Aaliyah to room 308, code yellow. Possible cardiac instability," she said into her radio before stepping fully inside. Janice blinked slowly, recognition flickering but dim. Something's not right," she whispered, her voice thinner than paper. "I'm here," Aaliyah said, already moving to check the monitor. The vitals confirmed her instinct, heart rate erratic, oxygen saturation dipping into dangerous territory. She gently guided Janice into position, checked her pulse, and tapped her name into the bedside panel to initiate the emergency protocol. Within seconds, a nurse arrived with the crash cart. "She's destabilizing," Aaliyah said calmly, her mind already arranging the steps like a chessboard. "We're prepping for atropine and bolus 4. Set up the ECG leads. Let's confirm arrhythmia and rule out stroke." As she worked, her voice remained steady, but her hands moved faster than the eye could follow. Janice moaned, weakly swatting at Aaliyah's wrist in a gesture that lacked strength but not intent. Even now, especially now, the reflex to reject her touch remained, but Aaliyah ignored it. "There's no time for grudges," she murmured under her breath, inserting the IV with surgical precision. The readings on the monitor spiked again, briefly erratic, then dipped low enough that the nurse beside her winced. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She administered the atropine, double-checked the IV line, and spoke softly, steadily, to Janice, guiding her back, word by word. "It's going to pass. You're not dying today. Not on my watch." Another nurse arrived, this one bearing Janice's updated labs. Aaliyah skimmed them quickly, eyes locking on an unexpected electrolyte drop. "She's crashing from hypokalemia," she snapped. "Potassium, immediately. Push it in slow. We've got to stabilize the heart rhythm." And still, Janice stared at her like a ghost trying to remember its name. Aaliyah leaned closer, speaking now directly into her patient's ear, a voice barely more than a whisper. "Whatever else you think of me, I need you to hold on." 10 minutes passed like a lifetime compressed into seconds. The potassium infusion worked its way into Janice's system. Slowly, her vitals began to stabilize. The arrhythmia lessened. Her breathing evened out, and the panic faded from her glassy eyes. By the time the attending nurse began removing the ECG leads, Janice was resting again, eyes closed, shallow breaths replaced by a steady rhythm. She didn't speak, and Aaliyah didn't linger. She updated the chart, ensured the monitoring protocols were elevated, and quietly made her way out into the corridor. Mia found her near the nurse's station, holding the edge of the counter with both hands, her eyes closed as she inhaled deeply. "Tell me she didn't just crash on you," Mia said, already knowing the answer. "She did," Aaliyah replied, finally exhaling. "Arrhythmia. Electrolyte imbalance. We caught it early enough, and you're still standing. I don't know whether to be proud or worried." Aaliyah gave a faint smile. Maybe both. She walked away without another word, heading toward the stairwell, needing a few moments without the hum of machines or the buzz of fluorescent lights. She didn't take the elevator. She needed the motion, the climb, the rhythm of steps echoing through empty concrete. By the time she returned, Janice was awake again. The color had returned to her cheeks. The monitors were calm, and yet, when Aaliyah entered the room to check on her, the look she received wasn't one of gratitude. It was suspicion, sharpened by something darker. Janice turned her head slightly on the pillow, eyes narrowing. "What did you give me?" Aaliyah paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch. "I stabilized your heart. You went into early cardiac distress. You're recovering now." Janice sniffed. "I didn't ask for your hands on me. I told them I wanted someone else, someone normal." Aaliyah's jaw tightened for the first time, but her voice remained even. "You almost died, Ms. Whitmore. There wasn't time to call for preferences. I think you wanted something to go wrong, so you could play the hero." There was no anger in Aaliyah's eyes, only something colder, more resolute. "I don't need to play at anything. You're alive because of me. That's not theater. That's medicine." And without another word, she turned and left the room again. The door swung shut behind her like a closing verdict. Janice's gaze lingered on the empty doorway, unsettled, not by pain, not by weakness, but by the fact that she had been saved by the very person she refused to see as human. The calm that followed Janice Whitmore's stabilization was a deceptive one, a brittle peace that hung in the air like the stillness before a second storm. The nurses noted it first, whispering quietly among themselves at the station, as Janice's tone shifted from sullen to accusatory, then to outright hostile. Though her vitals had returned to normal and her strength had begun to re-emerge, her mood darkened by the hour, each interaction laced with new suspicion and a growing venom that felt less like recovery and more like a wound spreading deeper. By the second morning, Aaliyah approached room 308 with the weight of something unspoken pressing against her chest. The day's rounds had already brought her through a cluster of new patients, each grateful, each handled with clinical precision, and a touch of calm reassurance that had become her quiet signature. But this room, the one bearing Janice's name, felt different. Not difficult, not dangerous, just poisoned. She knocked once before entering. Janice sat upright this time, arms folded across her chest, eyes sharp and waiting, like a predator pretending to sleep. The television blared an early morning talk show no one was watching. She didn't look up. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," Aaliyah began, voice steady as ever. "I'd like to do a quick follow-up, review your progress, and schedule discharge prep if your labs hold stable." Janice didn't move. "I didn't give you permission." Aaliyah paused just inside the room, processing the words with quiet clarity. "Permission for what?" "To touch me. To do any of what you did. I didn't consent to your little treatment. And now I'm speaking with an attorney." Aaliyah blinked once, then crossed calmly to the bedside monitor, scanning the readouts. "Your consent was noted in the intake forms and again verbally when I first examined you. During your cardiac episode, you were unconscious. Emergency protocol allows for immediate intervention under implied consent." "I don't care what your hospital handbook says," Janice snapped, finally turning toward her. "I want it on record that I did not approve of your hands on me. I want it on record that I didn't feel safe, that I still don't." There was a beat of silence in the room, thick enough to be felt in the lungs. Aaliyah's hands stayed by her sides, her shoulders square, her voice unshaken. "You were dying, Ms. Whitmore. The procedures that saved your life were medically necessary and administered within legal and ethical guidelines. Any physician would have done the same." Janice scoffed, her lips curling. "But it wasn't any physician, was it? It was you. You and your agenda. Don't think I haven't noticed the attitude, the way you look at me like I'm beneath you." "I don't think you're beneath me," Aaliyah said softly. "But I do know I stood over you when your heart faltered, and I made sure it kept beating." "That doesn't give you a free pass," Janice hissed, voice rising now, loud enough that a nurse passing by glanced toward the door. "I've already filed a complaint. I'm going to talk to the hospital director. I want you off my case, and if he doesn't do anything, I'll sue this entire place into the ground." Aaliyah remained silent for a long moment, not because she didn't have words, but because choosing the right ones had always been the difference between enduring and inviting fire. "I'll note your request in your chart," she said finally. "But until another physician is assigned, I remain responsible for your care." "No, you're not," Janice barked. "You're not responsible for me. You never were. I'm not some charity case you get to fix for a gold star. I've never once viewed you as a charity case," Aaliyah replied, this time letting the edge in her voice surface. Not anger, not frustration, just something colder and more precise. "You're a patient. One of many. But the difference is, you are the only one trying to rewrite the truth because you can't stand who it was that saved you." Janice's mouth opened in indignation, but nothing came out at first. A moment passed. Then she snapped, "Get out!" Aaliyah nodded once. "I'll ensure another physician sees you this afternoon. In the meantime, you'll remain under observation." She turned and walked out without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind her. Not loud, not dramatic, but final enough to make the point. Back at the nurse's station, Mia was waiting with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. "She's escalating," Mia said quietly. "She's fabricating," Aaliyah answered. "I just read the complaint she sent to admin. She said you were forceful, that you ignored her objections, that you physically restrained her." Aaliyah let out a slow breath, the kind that seemed to leak from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "And the hospital will have to log it, conduct a review, go through the motions." Mia stepped closer, dropping her voice. "You're not going to say anything? Fight it?" Aaliyah didn't answer right away. Her fingers tapped lightly against the tablet in her hand. Her eyes were distant, but not detached. Focused, calculating. "She wants me rattled," she said finally. "Wants to provoke a reaction. And if I give her one, I lose ground. I lose control. You think staying silent will help? I think staying calm will help me see the pattern." Mia studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Well, just know I've got eyes on her room now. If she pulls anything else, she won't do it unobserved." "Thank you," Aaliyah said quietly, then turned back to her patient queue. But even as she moved forward, there was a shift in her bearing. Not defeat, not retreat, but preparation, a tightening of posture, a steel setting in the spine. Janice Whitmore had started something more dangerous than she realized, and Aaliyah was no longer just a physician. She was a witness. The next morning came with a cold stillness, the kind that sank beneath the skin before the sun had time to soften its grip. The hospital floor stirred awake with the usual rhythm. Nurses whispering shift changes, trays clattering down polished hallways, the dull hum of monitors never truly silent. But room 308 had become a storm cell waiting to erupt, and everyone who passed it could feel the air charged with tension. Dr. Nia Brooks reviewed the chart carefully before entering, her expression unreadable behind the horn-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose. She was tall, poised, her presence quiet but unmistakable. Aaliyah had spoken with her earlier that morning. Brief, clinical, to the point. Nia had nodded once, took the file without flinching, and said nothing more than, "Let's see what she does when the problem isn't the person, but the truth." She stepped into room 308, just as the nurse finished checking the IV line. Janice was sitting upright, wrapped in a shawl over her gown, arms folded tight like she'd been bracing herself for a challenge. The moment her eyes landed on Nia's dark skin, her entire posture stiffened, her expression shifting into something half horrified, half outraged. "You've got to be kidding me!" she snapped before Nia could speak. "Another one?" Nia didn't react. She calmly walked to the foot of the bed, chart in hand, voice even. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore. I'm Dr. Brooks. I'll be overseeing your case now." "I asked to be assigned a new doctor," Janice barked. "I meant a real doctor, not some diversity hire they pulled off a brochure." Nia's gaze didn't flicker. "I completed my residency at Johns Hopkins, graduated at the top of my class, and have 12 years of clinical experience in internal medicine. I am exactly the doctor you need." "You're exactly the reason people don't trust hospitals anymore," Janice hissed. "You're all the same, cold, arrogant, thinking we can't see through you." Nia didn't blink. "We're following the appropriate clinical protocol for your discharge, Ms. Whitmore. Your labs have stabilized, you're no longer symptomatic, and your cardiac rhythm has been regular for over 24 hours. You're being cleared to leave today." "I'm not going anywhere," Janice said sharply, gripping the bed rails. "Not until I've spoken to the hospital director. Not until this whole circus is addressed properly. First, I'm assaulted, then I'm lied to, and now you're telling me I have to leave? That's convenient. Refusal to comply with discharge without medical cause can result in administrative removal," Nia said calmly. "And since I know you've read every policy they've handed you, I'm sure you're aware of that clause." Janice's face flushed deep red. "I don't care what your policy says. I'm not leaving." By the time Nia returned to the nurse's station, Officer Mark Ridley had already been paged. He arrived within minutes, tall, broad-shouldered, quietly authoritative, with the look of someone who'd seen every variety of human behavior and had long since stopped being surprised. He listened as Nia and the head nurse explained the situation, then reviewed the file himself, flipping through notes with practiced patience. "She's fully stabilized?" he asked without looking up. Nia nodded. "No reason to keep her. She's refusing discharge purely out of spite, possibly to build some kind of paper trail for a legal complaint." Ridley closed the chart, handed it back to the nurse, and pulled out a small black folder from his belt. "I'll give her the courtesy of a verbal request. After that, we follow protocol." When Ridley stepped into the room, Janice didn't look afraid. She looked triumphant. "Took you long enough," she said sharply. "Maybe someone around here still knows what authority looks like?" Ridley didn't return the tone. His voice was calm, procedural. "Ms. Whitmore, per hospital policy and medical authority, you've been discharged. I'm here to escort you to the front lobby, where transport can be arranged, or where you may call for your own. We need the bed, and you're no longer under active care." "I'm not going," she said, tone sharpening. "If you remain non-compliant," he continued evenly, "we will initiate removal under Code Gray Protocol, which allows for non-medical ejection of patients, creating administrative obstruction. You'll still be free to file any formal complaints through hospital legal, but you cannot remain in this facility without a medical need." Janice's face twisted, not in fear, but in bitter frustration. The outburst came next, exactly as Aaliyah had predicted it would. A burst of yelling, accusations hurled at no one in particular, hands waving as though trying to summon sympathy from the fluorescent-lit walls. The noise brought nurses from down the hall. A few visitors nearby paused, startled by the commotion. Aaliyah, standing just out of sight beyond the station, heard every word. She didn't move, didn't approach. She didn't need to. Her absence was louder than her presence would have been. In the end, Janice allowed herself to be escorted out under protest, muttering threats about lawsuits, discrimination, and the media. Ridley never touched her. He didn't have to. He simply walked with her, a quiet wall of unbending authority that refused to argue or rise to bait. Once they reached the front lobby, he watched her vanish through the glass doors with the same impassive gaze he used for cardiac alarms and administrative lockdowns. Back upstairs, Nia looked at Aaliyah from across the nurse's station and gave a single nod. "She's gone," she said. Aaliyah returned it. Not for long, and both of them knew, even without saying more, that this wasn't over. Janice hadn't left defeated. She'd left with a plan. The sun had barely warmed the city's concrete bones when Aaliyah stepped out of her car and crossed the glass threshold into the hospital's main atrium. Her white coat hung from one arm, tablet tucked close, stethoscope curled neatly into the crook of her elbow. The lobby hummed with its usual dissonant rhythm. Volunteers rolling carts of tea and magazines, patients pacing nervously near the front desk, and nurses weaving through conversations with quiet urgency. It should have been an ordinary morning. But the voice that broke through the din was anything but. "I want the hospital director out here, now! This is outrageous! I have rights." The moment Aaliyah heard her, before she even saw her, her steps slowed, her breath cooling behind her lips like steel drawn in anticipation. And then, through the crowd gathering near the information desk, she saw her. Janice Whitmore stood squarely in the middle of the lobby like a protester on a pulpit, clutching a thick manila folder in one hand and a large handbag in the other. Her hair was styled differently now, more deliberately curled, more presentable, as though she had prepared for an audience. She wore a clean sweater, polished shoes, and a look that balanced indignation with theatrical righteousness. The security officer on duty was already trying to de-escalate, but Janice's voice cut through his words like a blade through soft cloth. "I was manhandled out of my room like some criminal," she bellowed. "I have proof, right here. This hospital endangered my life, and I'll take this as far as I have to. Channel 4 already has my statement." Aaliyah felt Mia step beside her, silent for a beat. "She's really back," she said flatly. "Less than 24 hours later," Aaliyah murmured. "Didn't even try to disguise it as coincidence." Mia's voice dropped a notch. "She's not here to complain. She's here to provoke. You know that, right?" "I do," Aaliyah said, her fingers tightening on her tablet, though her face betrayed nothing. "I also know I'm not going to hide." And with that, she stepped forward, weaving calmly through the onlookers until the crowd gave way to the center of the commotion. Janice turned the moment she saw her, her face twisted into a mask of rage and self-satisfaction, as though the villain she had rehearsed against had finally arrived on cue. "Well, look who it is," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The so-called doctor who nearly killed me, and thinks she can get away with it." Aaliyah remained where she stood, perfectly still. Her voice, when it came, was smooth and measured. "Ms. Whitmore, this is a public area. If you have a formal complaint, it can be filed through the hospital's legal office. But you are no longer a patient here, and your presence is disrupting operations." Janice laughed, sharp and bitter. "Disrupting? You assaulted me under the pretense of care, then threw me out when I started asking questions, and now you want me to just walk away?" "No one assaulted you," Aaliyah replied, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "Your condition was treated in accordance with medical protocol. Your refusal to leave after discharge violated hospital policy. You were removed under those terms. There is documentation for all of it." "You're lying," Janice hissed, her words no longer theatrical. Now they were trembling with something hotter, something more dangerous. "You think just because you hide behind a white coat and big words, people don't see what you really are?" The silence that fell between them was instant and heavy, the crowd frozen in the moment. Aaliyah didn't respond. Not immediately. She stood, tall and composed, letting Janice's words settle under the weight of their own ugliness. "I see exactly who you are," Janice whispered, just loud enough for only Aaliyah to hear. "And I'm going to ruin you." Then, before anyone could move, before the security officer to her left could react, Janice stepped forward and swung the heavy manila folder, its edge sharp with clipped corners, directly across Aaliyah's face. The blow wasn't hard enough to knock her off balance, but the suddenness, the open malice behind it, sent a collective gasp through the lobby. Papers spilled to the ground like scattered debris, and Aaliyah took one small step back, her hand instinctively lifting to her cheek where the folder had landed. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, but the silence she left in her wake was louder than anything Janice had shouted that morning. Officer Ridley arrived within seconds, parting the crowd like a blade through cloth. He took in the scene with one glance: Janice, breathing heavily, face flushed with adrenaline, and Aaliyah, unmoved but clearly struck. "Ma'am," he said, stepping between them, "place your bag on the floor and keep your hands where I can see them." "What?" "She attacked me. I was defending myself. I watched the whole thing," said the security officer, who had first tried to calm her. "You hit her." Ridley didn't blink. "Assault of a medical professional on hospital property is a criminal offense. You'll need to come with me." Janice sputtered, caught between denial and outrage. "I will not. I'm the victim here. I'm calling my attorney. This is a setup." She twisted toward the crowd, desperate for support. But no one stepped forward. Even those who had watched in silence before now turned away, unwilling to be part of the scene. Aaliyah didn't move as Ridley placed Janice in soft restraints. She didn't speak when Janice was led away, screaming about defamation, lawsuits, and conspiracies. She stood still, letting it all pass over her like wind around stone. Mia moved beside her again. "You okay?" Aaliyah lowered her hand from her cheek and finally looked away from the doorway where Janice had vanished. "She wanted a reaction," she said softly. "Now she has a record." By the following morning, the footage was already circulating. Grainy cell phone video captured from the lobby, showing Janice Whitmore mid-tirade, papers flying, her hand swinging toward a calm, motionless figure in a white coat. The clip was short, no more than 20 seconds, and while it confirmed the assault clearly to those who understood context, it wasn't the full story. It never was. Online, the narrative was already spiraling. Headlines danced across screens. "Elderly woman claims abuse by doctor. Hospital tight-lipped amid investigation. Viral lobby incident sparks. Outrage. Was this assault or self-defense?" The comments were worse. Half of them screaming for Aaliyah's license to be revoked. The other half mocking Janice's breakdown, framing it as performance theater. But very few cared for nuance. The truth was not trending. At the hospital, a different silence had taken hold. Heavier, more calculated, the kind that filled meeting rooms with carefully chosen language and eyes that didn't quite meet hers anymore. That morning, Aaliyah had been called in not for a debrief, not to document the assault, not even to ask if she was physically okay, but to receive a memo from HR with the carefully sanitized headline, "Administrative Leave Pending Internal Review." Mia had slammed the door behind them once they left the office. "They're afraid of bad press. That's all this is. Cowards. They're protecting the hospital's image," Aaliyah replied quietly, sliding the memo into her bag without reading it a second time. "And they think neutrality is the safest bet." "This isn't neutrality," Mia snapped. "This is abandonment." Aaliyah didn't argue. She just sat in the empty staff lounge, coffee cooling in her hands, the echo of yesterday's violence still circling her mind like a storm that hadn't yet found its edge. Officer Ridley had already filed his report, clear, factual, without room for interpretation. So had the security guard who had watched it unfold. But none of that had reached the public. The hospital hadn't released a statement, and Director Crane, who had once shaken her hand in front of donors and smiled for photo ops, hadn't said a single word since the incident. That evening, Aaliyah sat alone in her apartment, the city lights blinking across the window pane, her television muted, the headlines crawling across the bottom of the screen in bold white letters. She didn't need to hear them. She already knew the story they were telling, or rather, the one they weren't. Her phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. Angela Chen. She hesitated, then picked up. "I saw the video," Angela said without preamble, "and I've read the coverage." Aaliyah leaned back on the couch, eyes closed. "They've already written the ending. Only if you let them," Angela said calmly. "Are you pressing charges?" "I filed the report. I gave the statement. I let the system handle it." "You're letting the hospital handle it," Angela corrected. "But the hospital is protecting itself, not you." Aaliyah didn't speak for a long moment. Then, finally, "I don't want this to become a spectacle. I just want it to go away." Angela's voice softened, not with pity, but with the weight of hard-earned understanding. "You've spent your whole life making sure no one could accuse you of being angry, of being unprofessional, of being the problem. And now that you've done everything right, someone still threw a folder in your face and called you the threat." Aaliyah pressed her fingers against her forehead, the pressure grounding her. "Do you know what people are saying online?" Angela asked quietly. "Do you know what this could do to your license?" "I haven't read the comments," she murmured. "Well, I have. And I'm telling you, it's time to respond. Not with press releases, with action. You think I should sue? I think you should remind them you have the right to fight back." It wasn't a decision Aaliyah made in that moment. Not with fire, not with anger. It settled over her like a weight rediscovered. A memory, the years spent biting her tongue, the patients who questioned her credentials before learning her name, the long hours proving herself twice over for half the recognition. And now this, her silence becoming their weapon. She opened her eyes slowly, the city's glow reflecting off the tablet on her coffee table. Her inbox was already flooding with reporters asking for statements. Her hospital ID still lay next to her keys, its corner slightly bent from yesterday's impact. "You'll take the case?" she asked quietly. Angela didn't hesitate. "We'll file the civil suit first. Defamation, reputational damage, emotional distress. After that, we'll let the criminal side play out. I've already got the footage backed up in 3 locations. And Ridley's report? Gold." Aaliyah nodded slowly, not because she needed convincing anymore, but because the choice had finally anchored itself in her bones. "I'm not doing this for attention. You're doing it for every professional who's ever been made to choose silence over dignity," Angela said. "We make our names by enduring, but we make our legacy by refusing to stay quiet." By the time the call ended, the sky outside had deepened into a velvet hush, the headlines still crawling endlessly across the muted screen. But Aaliyah wasn't watching them anymore. She stood, moved to her kitchen, and poured out the cold coffee still sitting in her thermos from that morning. It hit the sink in a slow spiral, dark against the porcelain. The next cup would be fresh, the next step hers to define. The courthouse steps gleamed under the weight of television lights and camera flashes, each bulb capturing a carefully constructed performance playing out in real time. Janice Whitmore stood just beyond the press rope, draped in a soft blue cardigan that washed out the blotchy red flush of her face, her cane held in both hands, even though no one recalled her needing one during her discharge. Her attorney, a polished man in a navy suit with salt and pepper hair, and a voice sharpened by years in front of microphones, stood just behind her shoulder, as if rehearsed for this very posture. "We want to be clear," he began, addressing the cluster of reporters. "This is about safety, about patient rights. My client, a retired teacher and grandmother, entered a hospital expecting care, and instead experienced something traumatic. She was manhandled, humiliated, and then discarded. Janice sniffled on cue, dabbing a tissue to her cheek, though no tears fell. "She's not here to attack anyone," the lawyer continued. "She's here to protect future patients. This is bigger than one incident. It's about accountability." The doctor in question remains silent. The hospital remains unaccountable, but we will not be silenced. Aaliyah watched the broadcast from Angela's office, seated quietly at the corner of the long glass table that overlooked downtown. The windows were open just enough for the city's murmur to slip through. A dull rhythm of distant horns and footsteps, as though the world were carrying on beneath the drama that had threatened to consume hers. Angela stood beside the screen, arms folded, eyes narrowed, not with frustration, but with calculation. "They've got media consultants, 2, maybe 3, she murmured. "Every soundbite is designed to provoke sympathy. Teacher, grandmother, even the sweater is a strategy. Pastel colors test better with conservative audiences. Makes her look delicate, harmless. She's not," Aaliyah said softly. "No," Angela replied. "But perception isn't about truth. It's about design." The silence between them stretched. Then Aaliyah spoke again, her voice more distant now. "It's strange. I saved her life. She knew it, felt it. But now she walks into interviews pretending I'm the one who endangered her." Angela's gaze didn't waver. "She's not pretending. Not fully. The type of hate she carries needs to believe itself righteous. She needs to be the victim. Or else the lie collapses. And the hospital still hasn't said a word." "They won't," Angela said. "Not unless they're legally forced to. They're more afraid of being named in your countersuit than they are of the press." "That silence? That's strategy, too." Aaliyah's eyes drifted toward the muted footage playing again on the television. This time, a panel of pundits dissecting the incident without context, debating everything from professionalism to hospital bias to the troubling optics of physician conduct. None of them were doctors. None of them had read a chart, but all of them had opinions. "I was calm," Aaliyah said, "every second of that day. I followed protocol. I documented everything. She refused discharge. She struck me. There were witnesses." Angela nodded. "And now it's time to use every one of those facts." She turned and opened a case folder on the table, sliding forward a still frame pulled from the hospital's security footage. Janice, mid-swing, arm blurred in motion. The timestamp burned clear in the corner. "We'll submit this, along with Ridley's incident report, his body cam audio, and the security guard's written statement. But more importantly, I've subpoenaed all her prior hospital records." Angela flipped to another section of the file and tapped her finger on a page. This isn't her first complaint. It's not even her second. She's filed formal grievances at 2 other facilities, one dismissed entirely, the other flagged for manipulation of information. In both cases, the attending doctors were people of color. Aaliyah straightened, the quiet burn in her chest sharpening. "You're saying this is a pattern?" "I'm saying it's a strategy," Angela replied. "One she's used before, but this time she chose the wrong target. And we're going to show the court exactly what she's done, who she's done it to, and how this isn't about negligence. It's about narrative." The fire in Aaliyah's chest settled into something steadier. Still burning, but clean, focused. Angela closed the file and looked her square in the eye. "We're not just going to defend you. We're going to dismantle the story she's built piece by piece, slowly, obliquely, professionally." "What about the hospital?" Aaliyah asked. "They'll try to stay on the fence," Angela said, "but I've filed a motion to make them release the full footage, not just the lobby. Every interaction, every recorded log. Once it's all out in the open, silence becomes complicity, and they know it." Aaliyah leaned back, letting the weight of it all settle against her spine. She had spent her entire career walking lines others never had to consider. Firm, but not aggressive. Direct, but never harsh. Competent, but never intimidating. And even now, With all the proof on her side, the only way forward was to prove it again. But this time, she wouldn't be doing it to keep her job. This time, she was doing it to make sure no one else would have to stand in the same hallway, silent, while someone like Janice rewrote the truth with a louder voice and a longer history of being believed. Angela reached for the remote and finally turned off the screen. "We go to court in 3 weeks," she said. "But the real trial starts now." Aaliyah nodded once, her voice barely more than a breath, but steady, unshaken. "Let's begin." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and polished marble, a strange mingling of formality and fatigue, the kind of air that had absorbed decades of whispered pleas, broken confessions, and cold judgments. The corridor just outside the courtroom was quiet that morning, the hush stretching long and taut like the hallway itself, lined with benches too stiff for comfort and windows too narrow for light. Aaliyah stood near the far end, reviewing a final set of notes Angela had handed her. Her suit was midnight black, tailored and pristine, not because she cared about the cameras waiting beyond the courthouse doors, but because it reminded her of who she was beneath the noise. Her hair was tied back neatly, her heels low but sharp, her presence as still and deliberate as ever. But there was something deeper in her posture now, something forged not from silence, but from choice. She heard the voice before she saw her. "I suppose you think dressing like that will make them forget what you did." It came from behind her, no longer echoing through a crowd, no longer cloaked in performative civility. It was smaller now, personal, laced with venom, undiluted by public theater. Aaliyah turned slowly, eyes lifting from the folder in her hand. Janice stood no more than 6 feet away, her posture just a shade too rigid, her expression trying to settle between smirk and sneer. The cane was still in her left hand, though her grip was looser now, as though she was holding it more for show than need. "This hallway is monitored," Aaliyah said evenly, her voice a velvet blade. "If you're hoping to stage another performance, choose your words carefully." Janice laughed, the sound brittle. "I don't need to perform. You've already done the damage for me. Do you think I'm afraid of that courtroom? I've lived in courts longer than you've worn that white coat." Aaliyah took a slow step forward, not threatening, not challenging, just closing the space enough to be heard without raising her voice. Her eyes never left Janice's. "You've built your whole life on the assumption that people will believe you, that your word carries more weight because of the way you look, the way you speak, the way you cry when the cameras roll. And for a long time, that worked. You walked into rooms and twisted facts like they were yours to command, because no one ever dared confront you." Janice blinked, momentarily caught off guard, not by the words, but by the clarity with which they were spoken. "But not this time," Aaliyah continued. "Not with me. You picked the wrong woman." Janice's voice dropped, her anger no longer theatrical. Now it was real. "You humiliated me. You put your hands on me, and then paraded around like a martyr. You think you're better because you wear that white coat and speak in calm little sound bites, but deep down, you're just another angry—" "Finish that sentence," Aaliyah said, her tone suddenly harder than steel. Janice's mouth opened, then closed. "You want me angry?" Aaliyah said, her voice now colder, heavier. "You want me to break that calm so you can wave it around like a flag in court? Tell the jury I'm unstable, emotional, dangerous? That's what you're here for. To provoke, to poke, until I give you the story you've already written in your head." She took another step forward, and this time Janice stepped back, barely perceptible, but real. "You spent your life walking into rooms certain you'd be believed. I spent mine having to prove my worth before anyone learned my name. So no, I don't need to raise my voice. I don't need to scream. But when I walk into that courtroom, I'm going to dismantle every lie you've ever told. Word by word, chart by chart, timestamp by timestamp." Janice's grip on her cane tightened. "You won't win," she said, but the words lacked certainty now. People like me don't lose to people like you. Aaliyah tilted her head, the calm returning, but now sharpened, honed into something that cut deeper than anger ever could. You've already lost, she said softly, because you don't even know what you're fighting for anymore. You think this is about pride, about some imagined injustice, but it's not. It's about truth, and the truth doesn't need to shout. Footsteps echoed from down the corridor. Angela's heels, unhurried but approaching. Janice glanced toward the sound, then back at Aaliyah. I hope you're ready to be humiliated in front of the entire courtroom, she snapped. I've been humiliated, Aaliyah said, by systems, by patience, by silence. But never again. Angela appeared beside her then, placing a quiet hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. Her eyes flicked briefly to Janice, expression unreadable. We're up, she said. Aaliyah didn't look back as they walked toward the courtroom doors. She didn't need to. She could feel the heat of Janice's frustration lingering behind her, heavy and sour like a flame that couldn't find oxygen. But she wasn't burning. She was building. And by the time the courtroom doors opened and the gavel struck, Aaliyah Ellison wasn't walking in to defend herself. She was walking in to end the lie that had been dressed as truth for far too long. The courtroom was colder than expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. A strange, clinical stillness that settled over the room like frost, quieting voices and stilling movement as though even sound had to ask for permission before entering. The walls were high and bare, washed in a pale shade of government beige, and the only color came from the slow shifting of the gallery's eyes, tracking every twitch, every glance, every flicker of expression, like prey waiting for a falter. Angela Chen stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who had built her weapons carefully, slowly, deliberately, and was now sharpening them one at a time in full view. Her tone was composed, her cadence slow enough to make every word feel weighted, her presence neither theatrical nor detached, but balanced precisely between precision and pressure. Janice Whitmore sat on the stand with her cane propped beside her, shoulders squared as if she were daring the air itself to disagree with her. Her attorney sat slightly leaned forward at the defense table, one hand resting on a legal pad filled with underlined phrases that had already lost their shine. Angela circled the stand, pausing for the briefest moment before speaking. Ms. Whitmore, she began, voice smooth as glass, earlier you stated that you never gave verbal or written consent to be treated by Dr. Ellison. Is that correct? Janice nodded. That's right. I made it clear I didn't want her near me. Angela turned, taking a step toward the evidence table. And yet, here in Exhibit C, she lifted a printed hospital intake form, clearly marked and highlighted. We have your signed consent form, dated and time-stamped, acknowledging both the attending physician assignment and emergency intervention protocols, including implied consent in the event of cardiac instability. Can you explain that? Janice shifted slightly in the chair, her mouth drawing into a thinner line. I signed that under pressure. I didn't read every word. They rushed me. So, to clarify, Angela said, holding the form lightly between her fingers, you claim that despite signing a document in 3 separate locations, one of which includes your initials next to a paragraph explaining emergency treatment policies, you didn't understand what you were agreeing to. I didn't trust her, Janice snapped. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw her. Angela's expression remained unreadable. So, it wasn't the policy you disagreed with. It was the physician. She didn't treat me with respect. Even though she saved your life? Angela's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Janice opened her mouth, but the words hesitated. Her lawyer objected. Something about tone, about badgering, but the judge waved it off gently, noting that the witness had invited the line of questioning. Angela returned the paper to the evidence table, but her next move was slower, more deliberate. She lifted a tablet from her briefcase, swiped across the screen, and turned toward the court. We'd like to enter into evidence a series of statements from two separate medical facilities in the surrounding county, where Miss Whitmore filed formal grievances against Black and Latino physicians over the past 5 years, both of which were dismissed after full internal investigations concluded no wrongdoing. Your Honor, these records were obtained through subpoena and have been verified by counsel. We believe they demonstrate a pattern. Janice's expression faltered, not collapsed, not shattered, but the veneer cracked just enough for the courtroom to feel it. Her hands tensed in her lap, one thumb pressing hard against the knuckle of the other. Angela continued, voice still level. Each complaint followed the same structure. Accusations of rough treatment, emotional distress, allegations of being manhandled. The same phrases appear repeatedly, almost word for word. Despite the complaints spanning different hospitals and entirely separate teams of physicians, Janice turned to the judge. That's not fair. That has nothing to do with this case. Angela met her gaze now, not from malice or triumph, but from purpose. It has everything to do with this case. Because the truth isn't in one incident. It's in the repetition. In the assumption that every person who doesn't match your idea of a proper physician is a threat to be documented, discredited, and destroyed. Before Janice could respond, Angela turned back to the judge. And finally, Your Honor, we have a witness who has requested to testify anonymously for fear of retaliation. She's a nurse who served under Ms. Whitmore during her time as a school administrator, and she reached out after seeing this trial covered in the news. With the court's permission, we'd like to admit her sworn statement into the record. The judge glanced toward the defense, who hesitated, then objected softly, only for the judge to overrule, citing the validity of the statement and its relevance to character assessment. Angela handed the file to the clerk, then returned to her seat beside Aaliyah, who had watched the entire exchange not with vengeance in her heart, but with something far heavier, clarity. She's unraveling, Angela said beneath her breath. You feel it? Aaliyah nodded slowly. I feel it, but it's not enough. Not yet, Angela agreed. But it will be, because the truth doesn't need to hit hard. It just needs to keep hitting. Across the room, Janice sat frozen in her chair, her shoulders not quite as square, her eyes not quite as defiant. For the first time, she didn't look like a woman in control of the room. She looked like someone trying to remember how to lie without shaking. And outside the courtroom, more voices were beginning to stir. Nurses who had worked quietly under threat of complaint, physicians who had tolerated abuse in silence, people who had waited too long for someone to go first. And now that someone had, by the third day of testimony, the courtroom had shifted. Not outwardly, there were no outbursts, no slammed gavels or raised voices, but something quieter had begun to settle beneath the surface, a hum that threaded itself through every side glance, every exchange, every adjustment of posture from jury to bench. It was the sound of perception beginning to tilt, the subtle creak of a story unraveling in slow, irreversible strands. Angela walked into the chamber with that same unhurried poise, her binder clutched loosely in one hand, the other resting just briefly on Aaliyah's shoulder as they took their seats. She said nothing, but the gesture carried the kind of weight no opening argument ever could. It was the steadying touch of a woman who knew the endgame had begun. Janice was seated at the opposite table, no longer postured for sympathy. Her shoulders sagged just slightly, her face paler than it had been, lips pressed thin to keep from trembling in plain view. Her attorney was still composed, still flicking through notes and case law with practiced detachment, but the space between them had changed. Once tight and defensive, now it stretched awkwardly. Two people no longer certain of the script they'd rehearsed. The judge entered without ceremony. The court resumed. Angela rose. The prosecution calls Officer Mark Ridley to the stand. There was a faint stir as Ridley stepped forward, the steady rhythm of his shoes echoing softly along the polished floor. He moved like a man unbothered by spectacle, guided only by duty, and when he sat, his presence grounded the room in something solid. The oath was administered. Angela approached slowly, her voice calm. "Officer Ridley, you were present at the time of the incident on hospital property involving Ms. Whitmore and Dr. Ellison, correct?" "I was," he said, his voice even and deliberate. "Can you describe what you witnessed?" Ridley leaned slightly toward the microphone, his words measured with care. "I was called to the main lobby in response to a patient who had returned after being discharged. When I arrived, Ms. Whitmore was in a verbal confrontation with Dr. Ellison. Before I intervened, I witnessed Ms. Whitmore strike Dr. Ellison with a manila folder in a deliberate, physical manner." "And what was Dr. Ellison's response?" "She did not retaliate. She didn't raise her voice. She remained calm, collected." Angela nodded once. "Did the hospital's internal security footage corroborate what you saw?" "Yes," Ridley answered. "It matched exactly what I witnessed in real time. There was no need to elaborate. The jury had already seen the footage." Angela simply allowed the weight of the officer's steady testimony to linger in the air like a closing door. She thanked him and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, I would like to enter into evidence a statement from an attending nurse present during Ms. Whitmore's initial outburst during her stay. With the court's permission, we've secured live testimony from this witness today." The judge gave a nod, and a soft stir rose from the gallery as a young woman stepped through the side door. Her uniform was crisp but modest, her hair pulled back, hands clutching a printed statement that trembled faintly as she moved. Her name was Mariah Gaines, a third-year RN, and one of the nurses who had attended to Janice during her stay. Under oath, her voice was quiet, but clear. "I was the nurse assigned to Ms. Whitmore on the second night of her stay," she began, eyes occasionally flicking toward Aaliyah, as though drawing strength from her presence. "I witnessed repeated hostility toward Dr. Ellison. Ms. Whitmore referred to her with inappropriate language. She would become agitated whenever Dr. Ellison entered the room, often exaggerating symptoms or feigning distress." Angela approached slowly. "Did you ever witness anything that suggested Dr. Ellison had mistreated Ms. Whitmore?" Mariah shook her head. "Never. Dr. Ellison was calm, patient, professional, even when Ms. Whitmore called her names, even when she accused her of things that clearly weren't true." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Angela asked gently. "Because I was scared," Mariah admitted. "I'm new. And when someone like Ms. Whitmore threatens lawsuits and storms around demanding to speak to administrators, it's easier to stay quiet. But I knew what I saw, and I knew if I didn't say something now, I'd be part of the lie." Angela didn't press her further. She let the honesty settle, raw and human. And when she turned to return to the table, even the judge's expression had changed, subtle but shifted. As the day wore on, more threads began to pull free from the tapestry Janice had woven. A former hospital administrator testified about prior complaints she had filed. A physician from another facility appeared via video call to describe eerily similar accusations, worded nearly identically. With each voice, the story Janice had crafted began to fray, not with sudden scandal, but with quiet, methodical unraveling. And through it all, Aaliyah sat steady, her posture never faltering, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed forward, not on Janice, not even on the jury, but on the idea that after everything, the truth was still pushing forward, foot by foot, word by word. During recess, she stepped into the empty hallway just outside the chamber, the silence welcome after hours of scrutiny. Angela joined her, arms crossed loosely, face unreadable. "She's going to break," Angela said quietly. "If not tomorrow, the day after. She's losing the room. She lost the truth a long time ago," Aaliyah replied. "Now she's just trying to remember what it felt like to be believed." Angela turned toward her. "How are you feeling?" Aaliyah exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward the courtroom doors. "Ready," she said, and in her voice there was no more caution, only resolve. By the time the court reconvened the following morning, the air inside the chamber had shifted from anticipation to quiet inevitability. The crowd was smaller now. Many of the reporters had begun drifting away, sensing that the headline they were hoping for was no longer viable. What remained was something heavier than spectacle. A reckoning slowly unfolding, each testimony tightening the thread around a woman who had spent her life assuming the world would never call her bluff. Janice sat at the defense table with her eyes downcast, the cane leaning slightly against her chair, untouched. Her attorney shuffled papers with increasing frustration, his jaw clenched tight, as if trying to hold the last pieces of their strategy together with willpower alone. The foundation had cracked, and everyone knew it. All that remained was how loudly it would collapse. Angela stood, calm and composed, as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to recall Dr. Aaliyah Ellison to the stand. A slight murmur passed through the gallery as Aaliyah rose from her seat, her suit crisp, her hair pulled back with exacting care, her expression measured but resolute. She walked to the witness stand without hesitation, placed her hand on the oath with the quiet gravity of someone who had waited her entire life to speak, not just on her own behalf, but for everyone who had ever swallowed their truth to keep the peace. Angela stepped forward. Dr. Ellison, she began, let's return briefly to the morning of the incident. When Mrs. Whitmore returned to the hospital lobby after her discharge, what was your first reaction upon seeing her? Aaliyah held the silence for just a breath before answering. I wasn't surprised. I knew she wasn't finished. And why is that? Because people like Miss Whitmore don't walk away quietly when the world doesn't bend to their version of it, she said softly. She wanted control over me, over the narrative, over what people would believe. And when she couldn't get it through the hospital system, she came back looking for confrontation. Angela nodded. Did you provoke her? No. Did you raise your voice? Threaten her? No. Did you strike her? Never. Angela turned slightly toward the jury, letting the simplicity of the exchange settle before continuing. When Ms. Whitmore struck you, you remained silent. Why? Aaliyah's eyes met hers without hesitation. Because that moment wasn't about retaliation. It was about exposure. Every person watching that lobby saw the truth she was trying to bury. If I had reacted, it would have confirmed every stereotype she came there to ignite. Instead, I let her speak her own truth. And it was louder than anything I could have said. There was a pause, not for drama, but because the weight of the words demanded space to land. Angela turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request the opportunity to present final visual evidence. A security audio clip recorded by Officer Ridley's body camera during the lobby altercation. The judge gave a short nod. Proceed. The clip played overhead, projected for both jury and gallery. It was short, no more than 30 seconds, but it captured Janice's voice crystal clear, laced with venom. You people think you can get away with anything, just because they let you wear a white coat. Then the sharp crack of the folder, the audible gasp of the crowd, the calm voice of Ridley stepping in. As the final second played, silence took hold again. But this time, it was not the silence of ambiguity. It was clarity, undeniable, and final. Angela faced the jury one last time. You've seen the footage. You've read the reports. You've heard the witnesses, both from this hospital and others. Ms. Whitmore's story relies on outrage, not fact, on performance, not truth. And Dr. Ellison, through it all, remained composed, professional, and restrained. She has not asked for sympathy. She has asked only for the right to protect her name, her career, and her dignity. She stepped back to her seat without flourish, letting the silence stretch again, letting the weight of evidence do what theatrics never could. The judge turned toward the defense table. Would the defense like to call a rebuttal witness or proceed to closing? Janice's attorney stood but did not move. He turned slightly toward his client as if waiting for something, but no words came from Janice. She sat frozen, her hand loosely resting on the cane, her face vacant. No longer defiant, no longer composed, just quietly unraveling beneath the realization that the floor beneath her had finally vanished. "No further witnesses, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Then we will proceed to closing statements at first recess. Jury will be dismissed for a short break." As the judge exited, the crowd began to stir, but Aaliyah remained still, her hands folded lightly in her lap, her eyes fixed forward, not on Janice, not on the press, but on the empty space just beyond the gallery rail, where the truth had stood waiting all this time. Unspoken, but unbroken. Angela leaned close, her voice low and even. "She won't recover from this." Aaliyah didn't smile, didn't gloat. She only nodded once, her voice just above a whisper. That was never the point. She stood, smoothed the front of her blazer, and walked out of the courtroom not in triumph, but in purpose. Because justice, when earned through truth, never needed to shout. It simply needed to be heard. The courtroom was quieter than it had been in days, not because the gallery had thinned or the stakes had diminished, but because something fundamental had shifted. It was no longer about accusation or defense. It was about consequence, about the words that had been spoken, the evidence laid bare, the lives tilted by the slow, deliberate gravity of truth refusing to be buried. It was about consequence, about the words that had been spoken, the evidence laid bare, the lives tilted by the slow, deliberate gravity of truth refusing to be buried. The gallery leaned forward not with curiosity, but reverence, as though everyone now understood the weight of what was unfolding, and knew better than to interrupt it. Janice sat at the defense table with her eyes fixed on a distant point no one else could see, her hands resting in her lap, motionless. The cane had slipped from her grasp hours earlier and now lay against the chair beside her, forgotten. Her attorney glanced toward her occasionally, as if trying to signal something, a final rebuttal, a last-ditch appeal, but there was no response. She had receded into herself, her expression no longer defiant, but hollow, as though the foundation she had built her entire identity upon had finally given way beneath her feet. Aaliyah sat with the same stillness she had carried since the beginning, her posture poised, her expression neutral, but inside she could feel the storm pressing in on every side. Not panic, not fear, but something older, heavier, the ache of a life lived carefully, precisely, deliberately, and now laid bare before strangers who held her future in the space between a breath and a sentence. The judge gave a short nod, and Angela rose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice slow and composed, "you've spent the past several days hearing testimony, reviewing evidence, and listening to the voices of both the accuser and the accused. You've seen the footage, you've heard the witnesses, and now you are tasked not only with deciding guilt, but with something much greater, whether facts still matter in the face of assumption, whether dignity still has a place when pitted against performance." She stepped closer to the jury box, not with drama, but with purpose. This case isn't about a single incident. It's about a pattern where a woman, confident, qualified, and calm, was targeted not for what she did, but for who she is. A woman who saved a life only to be accused of abuse. A woman who remained professional in the face of slurs and threats, only to be labeled dangerous. A woman who endured an assault, only to be told she must have provoked it. Angela paused, letting the silence land like a stone dropped in still water. And on the other side, a woman who has used this system before, who has weaponized fear and bias to silence those who challenged her comfort. A woman who walked into this courtroom wrapped in the language of victimhood, but whose own words and actions betrayed that mask again and again. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It simply continued. You don't have to choose between two extremes. This is not a matter of good versus evil. This is a matter of truth versus fabrication, dignity versus manipulation, justice versus noise. She turned slightly, her eyes now on Aaliyah, just for a moment. And at the heart of it all is Dr. Aaliyah Ellison, a physician, a woman, a human being, who did her job, who stayed silent, until silence became complicity. Angela returned to her seat, and the room seemed to exhale. There was no applause, no whispers, only the quiet tension of a chamber filled with people who had been given more than arguments. They had been given clarity. The defense declined closing remarks. The judge gave the final instructions. The jury exited. And then time fractured into stillness. Hours passed. Though they didn't feel like hours. They passed like breaths held too long, like pressure building beneath skin, like a heartbeat waiting for the pause between contractions. Aaliyah remained in her seat through most of it, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts drifting not to the courtroom, but to the hospital, to the patients she hadn't seen in weeks, the staff who had sent quiet messages of support, the echo of the corridor where it had all begun. She thought of her parents, of her first white coat, still hanging in the back of her closet, sleeves too short now, but memories still sharp. She thought of the first time a patient asked if she was really the doctor, the first time she was mistaken for a nurse, then for a janitor, the first time she realized she would need to carry twice the proof to be seen as half as credible. And then the bailiff's voice cut through it all. Jury has reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again. The judge returned. The jury filed in with deliberate steps, their faces unreadable. Aaliyah didn't look at them. She didn't look at Janice. She looked straight ahead, eyes focused on nothing and everything at once. The foreperson stood. In the matter of Whitmore versus Ellison, we, the jury, find in favor of the defendant. A heartbeat. Then another. In the matter of the countersuit, Ellison versus Whitmore, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Damages to be awarded as determined by the court. No cheers, no cries, just silence. And then a slow turning of heads toward Aaliyah, who had not moved, had not blinked, had not changed her expression. Because winning, for her, had never been about applause. It had been about breathing again. She rose quietly, gathering her things. Angela placed a hand gently on her back. A few reporters stood, as if unsure whether to approach. Janice remained in her seat, unmoving, as though even she understood that the room no longer belonged to her. Aaliyah walked toward the exit without looking back, because the story, at last, was no longer hers to survive. It was hers to own. The courthouse steps gleamed under the soft afternoon sun, the warmth of the light unable to fully mute the cold history of the day behind them. The crowd outside had thinned considerably. No more camera flashes, no press scrambling for angles, no voices shouting over one another to capture scandal. The verdict had already passed like a storm, and those who came chasing headlines had moved on, disinterested in aftermaths that couldn't be molded into clickbait. But Aaliyah didn't care for the silence. She welcomed it. She stood just beyond the granite archway, her blazer slung over one arm, her heels firm on the stone beneath her feet. The breeze teased the hem of her dress, the city moving around her as if she had never been the center of its attention, as if everything were returning, slowly, to normal. But she knew better. Nothing would be normal again. Not in the way it had been. And that, she had decided, was exactly how it needed to be. Angela had lingered inside, gathering the final paperwork, with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. But Aaliyah had stepped away early, needing air, needing the sky, needing the open space to stretch inside herself and feel what justice actually tasted like when it finally arrived. She didn't expect to see Janice, but there she was, stepping through the heavy courthouse doors with her attorney flanking one side and a paralegal grasping her bag on the other, moving like someone who no longer understood how the world could keep turning without first asking her permission. Janice paused the moment her eyes landed on Aaliyah. Her steps halted. Her expression twisted. not with confusion or pain, but with raw, pulsing hatred. The calm, tear-stained victim who had stood behind microphones days earlier was gone now. Her mask stripped away by verdict and evidence, her entitlement bleeding through every gesture like ink spreading beneath cracked glass. Her lawyer said something under his breath, urgent, warning, but Janice no longer seemed interested in listening. She took a single step forward, then another, her hands rising slightly as though words alone couldn't carry the venom she needed to release. The motion was abrupt, almost reckless, and her attorney's hand snapped out to catch her wrist. "Do not!" he hissed, low but audible. The paralegal moved in, gripping her other arm. Janice's mouth opened, a sharp intake of breath bursting out like the start of a scream. But no full words followed, just a choked, garbled noise, all fury and impotence, the final sputtering of someone who had spent her life cloaked in consequence-free rage and had finally, irrevocably, found its limits. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She didn't move. She stood still as a statue carved from quiet triumph, her eyes locked on the woman whose lies had threatened to end everything she had built. There was no sympathy in her gaze, no sorrow, no pity, only a steady, unblinking calm that burned hotter than any shouted insult ever could. Janice lunged again, barely a half step, but was immediately pulled back, both her arms now restrained by the hands of the men beside her. Her voice finally rose, cracked and shrill and trembling. "You don't deserve this, any of this. You think you've won? You think this makes you better?" Aaliyah's lips curved, slowly, faintly. A smile so subtle it didn't reach her eyes, but carried enough meaning to silence the entire street if anyone had been listening. "No," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "I don't think I'm better. I just think you finally got seen for what you are." Janice let out a sound, part snarl, part broken laugh, but it held no power now, no sting. Her voice was spent, her energy drained, her body pulled back by those who knew better than to let her spiral again in front of cameras that might still be watching from nearby windows. Aaliyah didn't raise her voice, didn't step forward. She simply tilted her head slightly, her smile remaining in place. Controlled, knowing, precise. "You should be grateful," she continued, quieter now, as if the words weren't meant for the lawyers or the crowd or even the city behind them. "Because I could have torn you apart in that courtroom, but I didn't need to. I let your own words do it for me." Janice's breath was heaving now, her chest rising and falling too quickly for someone who had pretended fragility so convincingly only days before. Her eyes were wide, wild, as if seeing for the first time that control had slipped from her fingers and would never return. And Aaliyah, still motionless, still poised, took one step closer. Not aggressive, not threatening, just enough to force Janice to look up into her eyes and see what real power looked like when it came wrapped in dignity. "You spent your whole life thinking people like me were supposed to shrink when you spoke," she said softly, "but I don't shrink. I remember, and I build." Janice turned away with a violent jerk, shoving past her handlers, muttering curses that quickly became unintelligible noise swallowed by traffic and distance. Her exit was not a retreat, but a slow unraveling, a final vanishing act from a stage where no one applauded her anymore. Aaliyah stood still for a long moment, letting the silence stretch again, letting the breeze press gently against her skin. And then, finally, she allowed herself the full smile she had denied until now, slow, knowing, earned, because justice, in its truest form, doesn't need a stage. It only needs a witness. The hospital lobby looked almost exactly the same as the day she left it. Sunlight streaming in through tall windows, the scent of antiseptic lingering beneath the faint aroma of burnt coffee, and the low, constant murmur of movement that never truly ceased. Nurses moved through the space with practiced grace. Receptionists tapped away at keyboards behind tall counters, and the rhythm of life, of healing, beat steadily through the walls once more. But for Aaliyah Ellison, everything had changed. She stood near the automatic doors for a moment longer than necessary, her coat folded neatly over her arm, her badge clipped once more to the collar of her blouse, and a silence beneath her ribs that felt less like uncertainty now and more like clarity. She wasn't afraid to be here. Not anymore. There was no weight pressing against her chest, no voice whispering that she didn't belong, no shadow of doubt trailing her through the hallways. This time, she had walked through the front doors not because she had to, but because she chose to. And that choice mattered more than anything. Mia spotted her first. She came from around the corner, clipboard in hand, the edge of a smirk already forming before she spoke. "Look who finally decided to return to the scene of the crime." Aaliyah smiled, her shoulders relaxing the rest of the way. "Scene of the justice, you mean?" Mia stepped closer, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. Damn right. They stood there for a beat, the embrace brief but anchoring, before Mia pulled back and looked her over. "You good?" "I'm better than good," Aaliyah said. And she meant it. "I'm clear." They walked together down the hallway, past familiar faces that now held something more than polite nods. Now they carried warmth and respect, and unspoken recognition. Not everyone had known the full extent of what she endured, but enough had watched it unfold in silence, and even more had seen the truth come to light when it mattered most. Harold Crane was no longer hospital director. The board had accepted his resignation quietly but firmly 2 weeks earlier, the pressure from public outcry and internal criticism finally outweighing his ability to remain passive. In his place stood an interim leader, one who, at the very least, acknowledged what had happened without euphemism or delay. And while the road ahead would still demand careful steps, it was no longer lined with the fear of retribution for simply existing. Angela's lawsuit had settled in Aaliyah's favor. The court had awarded damages, and the media had moved on, as it always did, but the impact remained. Janice Whitmore's name had become a cautionary footnote, and her legacy of manipulation, once protected by silence, now followed her wherever she tried to seek sympathy. But Aaliyah had gained something deeper than vindication. She had reclaimed her voice. Later that week, she stood behind a podium at a medical symposium, invited to speak not about the incident, not about the courtroom, but about bias in healthcare, about how systems fracture under pressure, about how truth doesn't always travel with a spotlight, but sometimes walks in through the side door and takes its place at the head of the room without asking permission. She spoke without anger, without venom. Her voice was steady, her words thoughtful, and every sentence carried the weight of experience, the kind earned through fire, but refined through resilience. She didn't name Janice. She didn't need to, because the lesson had never been about punishment. It had always been about precedent. After the symposium, she returned to her office, smaller than she remembered, filled with patient charts and framed diplomas, and a quiet that no longer echoed as loneliness. A new resident had left her a note on the desk. "Thank you for staying. You made room for all of us." She sat for a moment, holding the paper between her fingers, eyes drifting toward the window, where the city pulsed outside in slow, unbothered rhythm. She didn't cry. She didn't exhale with dramatic closure. She simply nodded to herself, folded the note carefully, and placed it in the drawer with her badge, her credentials, and a copy of the verdict now framed on the wall. Not to boast, but to remind, not of victory, but of truth. There would always be another Janice, another challenge, another shadow trying to rewrite her worth in whispers. But now, she had the language, the record, the precedent, and she would never again hesitate to use it. She stood, straightened her coat, and walked toward the door, back into the corridor where it had all begun. And this time, no one looked past her. Everyone stepped aside. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.